So, if you had a chance to look at the syllabus, there are two things that I had hoped to accomplish today. I'm just going to go ahead and pull that up real quick, just so we can have a look at it as a group. And just give me 1 second here. Logging into Canvas. Okay, I've got it up and running. So I had asked you all to locate the self-selected article that you will be writing the 2-page review on, which will be due next week. And what I was hoping to do today, if you all had the chance to find an article, was just to have you share it with us, talk a bit about it, maybe discuss why you chose it. And then once we got through that, answer any questions you might have about whether or not the article is appropriate, if it meets kind of the peer review standards, etc. And then talk about the previous 2 articles that you have already read and have either written reviews on or are in the process of writing reviews on. And those were the Kaufman articles, or the Kaufman article and the Vaughn and Swanson article. So, without further ado, was anyone able to locate an article that they were going to be using for the next assignment? Cool. I see Rachel raising her hand. I see Erin shaking her head yes. McKenna, have you had a chance to locate anything yet?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, but I'm trying to figure out if I can pull it up on my computer right now. That's what I'm working on.
Okay.
I just need to
and it's like you don't have to like share the screen and show it to me unless you want to. If it's printed, you can just
No, it's on my computer. I just have to locate it so I can tell you guys like the
I see that Rachel has some extensive highlighting already done. So sign of a consumed research paper.
Now this is one that we can use. This is part of our trends, correct?
You got it. So yeah, ideally this is, I mean, obviously this 2-page review that I'm asking you to write is going to be much longer than what I'm looking for in the annotation. Remember, the annotation is just like a very kind of concise paragraph. So, with the review that you produce for this article, you can just kind of greatly condense it and use it as one of your sources in the annotated bibliography. Okay. So, Erin, why don't you share first the article that you've selected for this assignment?
So to be honest, I found it like just before class started because I forgot about this.
Okay.
So I have it.
For the best of us.
Hey, child. Okay, so sorry, she's singing. So the article that I found is called Assistive Technology in the Inclusive Science Classroom.
Okay.
So I am going to take on technology as my trend.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, just thumbing through it, I'm seeing that there's information about no technology, and the requirement of no aids, light technology, being easily attainable adaptations that teachers can provide day to day, and then high tech. needs that students have that would require like computer access and electronic devices. There's information in here about helping students with note taking. There's information about writing assistance and using specific software to help them with their writing. There's information. This is really kind of cool, actually. I wish you could see it. So I have never had the opportunity to actually use Boardmaker, but the experience that I have with it has always been very cool.
So
But
Boardmaker for like picture exchange communication systems.
yeah,
Yeah.
there is a full lab on like blowing up a baggie using Boardmaker in here.
Okay.
It's really kind of cool. So I'm interested in reading this.
So I assume that blowing up the baggie is part of a science project.
It's part of a lab, but I mean, it's like the step-by-step instructions using Boardmaker.
Right.
So,
and so another question I have for you is, what is the name of the journal that article came from?
it came out of a journal called The Science Teacher.
The Science Teacher. Okay.
The Science Teacher.
Did
Let me go.
Did you locate it? Did you locate it using education full text?
Uh-huh.
Good.
Yep.
So it's peer reviewed.
Yep.
Good.
I did all of the modifiers to do that. It was written in March of 2007. So I mean, it's not extremely current, but very relevant still.
It's not always easy to find a lot of articles on a very specific topic that are all also very current. So that's understandable.
Yeah.
Cool. So technology in the classroom. Do you think you'll focus just on science, or are you just going to take a broader focus on different forms of assistive technology that can be used to help students achieve different educational outcomes?
I think I'm going to take a broader search. I found another article as I was looking called Emerging Reading with Writing Strategies Using Technology, and then one called Classroom Management with Exceptional Learners. And the one about classroom management is using technology to help with classroom management.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm just going to broaden it rather than focus solely on science. I'm not a science teacher by any means at all.
If you at any point find yourself at a loss for locating articles, there is a lot of use of like iPads, covert audio prompting for young adults with autism in the workplace.
Very cool.
Which is kind of a very up and coming and a subject that you would find a lot of research on. So using like iPads for like to kind of help students kind of work through different job tasks and stuff like that. The covert kind of audio coaching is more for like the social skills, right? So you would have a coach on the other end kind of listening in on this person's interactions with a customer and kind of coaching that individual, through the proper navigation of that customer interaction.
But I will look. I've worked with several students over the last few years that use iPads on a regular basis to help them with their communication. And one girl in particular this year, she's not mute, and I would not say that she is deaf. She just has a very, I don't know in particular what her disability is. She signs, and she tries to talk, but her parents use a assistive communication device for her, and I've gotten the opportunity to use it with her, and I find it to be extremely fascinating. So
cool.
I love the idea of using technology in the classroom.
Okay.
as long as it doesn't get overwhelming.
Yeah, no, which is a situation that can easily transpire. Marta, you were able to find your article for the assignment? You're also muted. You'll have to unmute your microphone there. Bottom left-hand corner of your screen.
I thought I could do it on my face, but I can't. Okay. My other one works that way. It doesn't on this one.
Okay.
Yes, I'm going to focus on the behavior and self-regulation strategies. I've been receiving several students moving into the district with behavioral issues.
Uh-huh.
And we don't have counselors.
Right.
I mean,
I recall you mentioning that some of them were like kind of technically homeless and there were some other situations. Yes.
I think I'm going to focus on that because that's where I feel like my greatest need is right now, on how to support them and how to support the teacher.
Okay.
So the one I have here is called Using Self-Regulation Strategies and Functional Assessment-Based Interventions to Provide Academic and Behavioral Support to Students at Risk within 3-tiered models of prevention.
Look at that. You don't even have to tell me that that's from a peer-reviewed journal because I can just tell by that title.
Yeah.
But what is the name of the journal, out of curiosity?
Preventing School Failure.
Okay, cool.
And basically, I kind of was really looking at wanting to find something that I could implement, a program that I could implement into the classroom, or procedures that I could implement into the classroom. And this has like your positive behavior support information. It also has self-regulation strategies and supports both at the secondary level, and then it goes into the 3rd level a little bit. And I was trying to remember exactly because I've just kind of gone over it. Talks about self-instruction, talks about goal setting. But I'm kind of concerned it may not give as much on the very intense intervention. So I'm going to look through it a little bit closer and see if I find that it's answered that question.
So intense interventions that would be appropriate for students with greater needs?
Yes. Well, like ED students, I have a student that's, and I always get this confused, OD.
Oh, is it oppositional defiance disorder?
Yes, defiance.
ODD? Yeah.
And he is a kindergartner, and he is just really, he's good at, everything we've tried works for a little bit, and then he just shuts down on it.
Yeah.
So we're going to a next level with him.
Okay.
And trying something else. We have counselors that he goes to that have come to meetings from CHD, but we're really kind of struggling with this little man.
Okay.
Trying to make the connections with him.
Well, I think it's great that you're choosing a topic for this assignment that is actually directly applicable to the situation that you're dealing with. I mean, that's like the perfect, that's like the ideal situation in my mind. And so speaking to your concern regarding the possibility that it might not go into enough depth on intensive interventions, when you're reading through it, I'm sure at some point intensive interventions will be mentioned in it.
Okay.
Okay, and generally after, the authors talk about different types of intensive interventions, you'll see the author's names in parentheses after the interventions.
Okay.
At that point, go to the reference page and just find those people's names, right? And then you're going to have those papers. right?
Okay.
Find one of those papers, and then you're probably going to be able to find a much broader range of information on intensive interventions.
Okay.
So these guys, you know, if the author of that paper is citing these individuals as, experts in this area, well, then their work is also going to introduce you to a broader range of experts also in the same area. So you could save yourself a little work of having to just kind of, type stuff into the search engine and just kind of scrolling through articles.
Okay.
That's always a good strategy.
All right. Thank you. That'll help.
Cool. Okay. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
Hello. Potty time was a success.
No, but that's okay. We just started last weekend.
Yeah.
With attempting potty time, so.
Yeah. No,
okay.
I have fond memories of that whole process.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so this is funny that I'm going right after Marta because this is like really related.
Okay.
So I'm also going to do behavior intervention, kind of researching different kinds of behavior interventions, and then specifically like for students with EBD, just because the students that end up on my radar are usually the ones who end up qualifying for EBD. So just the kids with kind of more complicated issues. So the first article is Intensive Interventions for Students with Emotional and Behavioral Disorders, Issues, Theory, and Future Directions.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so it's actually an introduction from a special issue of the Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders.
Okay.
So I'm going to.
You could get your hands on that journal. You could have a gold mine.
So it references, it's like the introduction, and it kind of introduces what all of the things have in common, like what all of the journal articles coming up have in common, but then it also lists those journal articles. So I'm going to look up those journal articles and like hopefully I can get them. But because it just sort of summarizes them very briefly. But it's about how the issue right now with working with students with EBD is that there are curriculums available, but even if they've shown in studies to work on certain kids, there's a lot of kids that it still won't work for. Yeah, just because, emotional and behavioral disorders are just like, that's a lot of different stuff.
Yeah,
like,
they're not all cut from the same cloth.
Right. So, which this is interesting because this is kind of like what I was interested. My dad and I have been talking a lot about how there's like certain things that are kind of like grabbed onto because you just need something to grab onto, but then it's like, if it's not the right thing, then it doesn't matter. It's just like throwing something at a kid and then hoping that it works.
Right.
So this is specifically about, they call it data-based individualization process model. And so that's what all the other articles are then about, using this with different curriculums basically, or with different approaches. But this is just generally overviewing what DBI is.
This is like a kind of a core foundational principle around which you could build a curriculum or something, right. or you could embed into a curriculum.
Right. So it's
generic in that sense.
Yeah. So it's a way to apply curriculums and to make sure that you're progress monitoring and that you're monitoring the right things for the student. And then that way, what you need to change about the curriculum to cater to that particular student. So it's really interesting. That's why I highlighted like way too much, because it's an introduction. So it's like a kind of a summary anyway, but it's really interesting. It just goes into the importance of making sure that you're collecting really good data, that you're being very like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not conscientious, or like, I don't know, that you're really
systematic.
No, that you're just being careful when you are picking a certain curriculum. And so you're like looking at, and it also talks about how there's a lot of curriculums that aren't very good, that are out there, but there also are a lot that are good, but you just need to be able to tweak them and utilize them through progress monitoring so that they are actually effective for the kid that you're working with.
Yeah, no, that's a challenge with curriculum. You go to like educational or special education conferences, and there's always the room with the vendors, and they have curriculums and strategies for solving all problems that one might encounter in the special education classroom. But it's like you try to go online and like try to find some empirical evidence that like these things have actually been demonstrated to be effective. Like a lot of them aren't. It's just kind of like the snake oil, salesman, kind of going from conference to conference, trying to package, sell these brightly packaged, kind of, easy to implement curriculums. Which is really a sad state of affairs because, these are, children with real needs that we're dealing with, and to try to profit off of, peddling some kind of approach that is, half-ass is really, really unethical.
Yeah, and it's sad because I feel like the teachers who kind of get the most invested in those are the ones who are really, really struggling, like with their classroom management, with those kids in their class. So they like latch onto anything at all, and they like really get behind this bandwagon, but then it doesn't really work. So it just is like they invest all this time and money and into this, and then it doesn't work.
Right.
And then, so this is about that. And then it also goes into kind of the ways that you should be doing your own kind of research with the students that you're working with. So it's talking about how like you can look at a study for kids who have, I don't know, like PTSD or something. And you might look at a study for like all these kids that have PTSD, and it might have worked really well in this group study, but the kid that you have with PTSD, it doesn't mean that it's going to work with that kid. So it's like kind of looking at how it's better to just kind of take each kid as your own little experiment sort of, and have to like cater it really to that kid. And so it goes into how to do that in different ways to like take data and to try different things. And it's cool.
Group experimental designs. Yeah. The global effect shows, a positive effect, but there are always students within that, experimental treatment group for which, or who did not experience kind of, the effects that the authors are claiming that the curriculum has the potential to confer upon all students. So.
Right.
Exactly. Rachel, can you tell me the journal name again?
Yes. The journal or the article?
Journal.
Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders. And it's a journal that's from the Hamill Institute on Disabilities. So I think that this is like a special issue. So it's like, I think that there's only one of those, the Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders, but then it's part of the Hamill Institute.
Okay, and then
the Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders sounds like an actual journal.
I know, but then it like just keeps referring it to it keeps referring to it as a special issue. So I don't know if it's a special issue of that journal.
Because a lot of journals, a lot of academic journals will have a special issue journal.
I wasn't sure. And then I didn't see the Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders. Like, I have a bunch of articles that I already found, but that one didn't pop up again. So I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting.
Okay. Well, I could be wrong, but I just do know that some journals do, like annually have like just a focus, like where they just one thing.
I'll have to see if I can find it. The other thing is that I actually got a bunch of articles. I found a lot more articles through Interlibrary Loan because we didn't have them, but then they emailed them to me like the next day.
Yeah, nice service.
Yes, and so that's really nice. So do that if you're having trouble finding stuff. And I found a lot of articles that I'm going to read from the Journal of School Psychology.
Right.
It had a lot more stuff.
And also, another potential valuable resource that has helped me out, like when I couldn't find stuff at the library, is just Google Scholar. If you go on Google Scholar, you can find legitimate peer-reviewed material as well. So that's another, tool in your tool belt if you get stuck.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, McKenna, you're up to bat.
Okay, so the article, or I guess the topic or trend that I was following was co-teaching. And so the article that I had found was called Co-Teaching with Strategy Instruction, and that is out of Intervention in School and Clinic,
Uh-huh.
which is from 2014. So it's not entirely new, but not that old either.
Yeah.
It was a peer-reviewed article that I had found on the Pierce Library, whatever, from Eastern. So from what I'd gathered from it so far was just the way, or I guess how research has already proven that co-teaching can be beneficial for special education students. However, it might be maybe the approach to co-teaching that is making it less successful than it potentially could be. And so that kind of rolls into what the special education teacher's role is when they're co-teaching. I think because oftentimes when we do push into somebody else's class to try to co-teach, we're like kind of sitting there watching them teach, and then we help out when, it's independent work time or something of that sort, where we don't have a defined role.
Right.
And so this article kind of talks about what that role should look like with evidence-based strategies.
Yeah.
And later on in the article, it kind of goes into different types of strategies that there are for helping co-teach. So, for example, some of them like organizational strategies or emphasis strategies, study skills, and things like that you bring to the table when you're planning for co-teaching that gives you a specific role so that the special education and gen ed peer are getting more out of the interaction.
Mm-hmm.
It also went into like a specific example so you could see how that like plays out in a typical classroom, and led you to tools to creating your own strategies like after you've already mastered these on ways to expand on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So it sounds like a nice comprehensive kind of introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you'll seek out articles,
Mm-hmm.
other articles that talk about different models, and
Yeah.
that would be interesting because there's not, as you mentioned, there's not just one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's this one concept of co-teaching, but there are an infinite potential ways of going about, implementing a co-teaching program.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's good to hear that you're all making progress. I want to just bring up the syllabus one more time because I want to call your attention to just a few things. We're all seeing this? Everyone seeing the syllabus? Okay, good. So on the 30th, so basically next week you'll read your article and write the review. On the 30th, I'll ask you all to just give a very brief presentation about the article. So basically November 6th, I'm going to have you read 3 papers about autism, and these papers are representing current trends and issues in autism, because I'm having you read these because, as you'll see on the 13th, I'll basically be kind of giving a presentation about a current trend or issue in special education. In this case, we'll focus on kind of the changing definition of what autism is and how it's been diagnosed. We'll talk about assessment issues in children and adolescents with Asperger's syndrome. So some of the, just a brief little teaser, kind of the inefficacy of some of these kind of like social skills or social cognitive assessments that are, informant completed or paper based, and how they really fail at getting at some of like the very nuanced social challenges that these students can experience. And this last paper, the Romanesque one, he talks about another very important issue when you really start looking into social skills and autism. Social skills versus social skilled behavior, right? It's one thing to teach somebody a behavior that is appropriate to do in a certain situation. and that's generally what we refer to when we talk about teaching a social skill. But it's another thing to teach behavior that is socially skilled in the sense that, or skilled social behavior in the sense that it's applied, kind of knowingly, in the sense that, you're not just kind of this stimulus responding to a stimulus. You understand why this behavior is skilled in this situation. So this is taking more of a distinction between a social skill versus a social cognitive approach. And you see confoundings of these two terms in autism literature all the time. Assessments of social skills will include test questions that are clearly measures of some kind of social cognitive ability, right? So those are the three reading assignments for that week. On the 13th, it'll all be me. I'll give my little talk, and then for the final 2 weeks, they're going to be work weeks for you all to really focus on your bibliographies. So we won't be meeting on the weeks, not the weeks of, but on November 20th or December 4th, because I want you all to have an adequate amount of time to do this project. And also, I'm taking into consideration the fact that in our other class, you also have a lot of projects and a lot of reading. So I want to kind of free up some of your time to work on that kind of stuff. And then on the 11th, we'll do our best just to give everyone the opportunity to just give a very brief presentation about the annotated bibliography. Like I'm talking, generally we have about 9 people in class, 10 articles per student. That's 90 articles. We have 120 minutes, so it's like, I don't know, 2 minutes per reference. So just kind of very quickly running us through it. And then, as I mentioned, I'll compile them all together in a master document and put that on Canvas. And then you all, if you want to print it out for future reference, you'll have that. So we are kind of getting close to, the end of the term. There's still some work ahead of us, but I'm happy with the progress that we've been making, and I'm very happy with the progress that you all are making and identifying important issues that are of personal and professional relevance. And so I thank you for that. Any questions on the schedule or anything at this point?
I have a question.
Yeah, who was that? Oh, that was Aaron, yes. Oh, you're muted again.
Just when I click off of it, I think it's unmuted and then I mute it. So on the 23rd, we are turning in chapter 5 from the other text, right? Or are we turning in chapter 4?
Are you talking about the other class?
Right, because when I keep going back and forth between the two syllabuses, I keep getting myself confused. And so I figured, while we're talking about this one, can we talk about the other syllabus also, just so I have a clear handle on what's actually due on those days?
Yeah.
So I know that all the question sets can be due on the what is it, the 13th? Is it the 13th?
So I opened it up to you all.
Okay.
As long as you get them all to me by the last day of the term. Ideally, I'd like to have them kind of filter in slowly, because then I'm not, overloaded with a bunch of grading to do at the end. But I also want to be sensitive to your schedule.
Okay. On 12/4, you just said that for this class, we have a work week, but on the other syllabus for 550, it says that 12/4 is the collaboration plan and resource map presentation.
Right, so so we actually don't have, here's what we can do. Let me bring up the other syllabus. Yeah, so I mean, I would like for you all to just give brief presentations about the collaboration plan and resource maps. And that's really the only day that we can do it, unless we want to like try to agree on another day, a different day of that week, if that makes sense.
Will the presentations take up the entire 2 hours?
No. I mean, we have a pretty small cohort, and you know, I mean, it's going to be very easy to go through just a collaboration plan and the resource map. You have the examples of what they'll look like. And so, you know, I'm just looking for just kind of a brief kind of overview and synopsis of each. So we, you know, we can set hard, you know,
Time
time
limit.
frames so that we don't end up staying the entire 2 hours.
Why don't we talk about it next week when there's a larger sample? Well, I'm not going to be here next week, but I mean, maybe we could do a poll for everybody since there's only 5 of us in class right now.
Or I just feel like just with confusion of like when classes are and when they're not, if we keep the class meeting the same, but try to shorten it so that we can get our presentations in and whatnot, and then have some
I like
more
that.
time at night to work on this class's assignment maybe.
Right, because recall that while we do have that presentation on the 4th, right, which is a Wednesday, you still have 10 days after that to get the annotated bibliography in. So, I mean, after December 4th, you will have no more work to do for collaboration and consultation unless you still have some of those question sets to do. So, so there still is a decent amount of time in between December 4th and then the end of the term to get that stuff done. So does that seem fair?
I say just leave it at 12:04.
Yeah, I agree. Because you won't have any readings for this class.
But definitely,
But what, say, go ahead.
but definitely November 20th, there will be no meetings for either class. Is that right?
And there's no class for Thanksgiving week either.
That's correct. No classes on Thanksgiving. Well, yes, no. Let me look. Not for you guys, no. The young cohort will meet Monday and Tuesday, but you guys have no classes the week of Thanksgiving. So those are, I mean, you'll be ideally, more than likely be with family celebrating, but there won't be any assignments or anything that you'll have to be, you know, working on or anything like that.
And so, and the 20th, you said no class for either one on the 20th.
November 20th?
Right.
Right.
No, I did not say that. November 20th, we have a class. We have collaboration and consultation.
You just said it was a work week.
I said it was a work week for this class, which is issues.
It's so confusing.
I
Okay.
apologize.
See, when you're saying it's a work,
dead week?
yeah, when you're saying it's a work week for one, I think everybody is taking into assumption that it's a work week for both classes, and so there's no class on 11/20 at all. I think that's what everybody's, well, at least that's what I was assuming when you said that. So that makes sense.
Okay.
I think he just means that there's no assignments due for this class, so it's a work week because there's nothing due.
Yeah.
No, we got it.
Okay.
Right. So work week was
So,
the wrong term to use because you're exactly right. It assumes that I see how yeah, I see the miscommunication there. But what I meant is that there are no assignments due and we will not be meeting for this class on the 20th or December 4th.
for this class.
For this class, 556.
So really our only day off will be the 27th, where we don't have class for either one. Correct?
The 27th is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving.
So that will be a day complete. We will not have class for either one.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, good. And listen, as we approach the end of the term, if things are piling up, if you're feeling stressed, if it's going to be necessary for some kind of extension, you just got to reach out to me personally, okay? And I'm going to do what I can to make your lives easy and to get these assignments done. So just know that as well. But for now, we're going to take our break. When we come back, we're going to have a very brief discussion about the two papers that we've read and written reviews about, the Kaufman and the Bond and Swanson papers, kind of a comparison and contrast activity. So why don't we plan on meeting back here at 6:03. It's 5:53 right now, so we'll take 10 minutes. So I will see you all then.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Marta, are you still on? No, she's not.
I can be there. Rachel?
Oh, hey, okay. So I was going to tell you that this, he was right. The Journal of Emotional and Behavioral Disorders is like just its own journal. So I just looked it up, and they have like a bunch of stuff on interlibrary loan that's from that journal. So yeah, just letting you know.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bye. See you in a little bit.
Okay.
Hey, Rachel.
Yeah.
Rachel, will you let him know that I'm gonna bail out? I'm feeling absolutely miserable right now.
Yeah.
So he X'd out before I had a chance to tell him that I was gonna leave. Will you just let him know?
Yes.
Thank you, dear. Have a great
Yep.
night.
You too.
Bye.
Okay, hello everyone. Tara, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
You came in just a little late, and I realized that we never got to hear from you about whether or not you were able to locate an article for the assignment that's due next week, and that's the 2-page review of a journal article that would be part of your annotated bibliography.
Yeah, I haven't found one that I've thought like was worth it yet. I mean, I've done a little bit of research and found some, but they were not they weren't very good, to be honest.
Okay.
And so I just need to research a little bit more and find one that's more quality, so I
Okay.
actually have something to write about.
Okay, and then just a quick reminder, your topic was the topic for the annotated bibliography.
Yeah, let me look. Just a second. My computer is giving me issues. It runs really slow when I'm on Zoom. Can I get back to you on that? Because my computer is not opening my files.
That's totally fine. You can just
Sorry.
you can just email me if you'd like. That'd be
Okay, that'd be great.
okay. So we had the opportunity to read 2 articles written by 2 researchers, both of whom held kind of differing perspectives on this idea of special education as, its own separate thing, performed in a separate setting, versus special education moving toward a more inclusive, relationship with general education. And so for those of you who have turned in your reviews, thank you. I enjoyed reading them. What I've done here is to have gone through both of these articles and just picked out kind of the gems that I believe are, really at the core of what the arguments are that these authors are trying to make. And when possible, I've tried to juxtapose situations in which, it's very obvious where the authors, are holding very different positions on the matters. And so what I thought we would do is just read through some of these. There aren't too many of them. And I would like to just hear your your perspectives, your thoughts, your feelings about the positions set forth therein. And also, I'm just going to be curious to know if you can identify, which of the authors was responsible for the quotes that I have included in these slides, because I did not indicate that information. So certainly we have 2 individuals, both writing in the year 2015, who hold somewhat differing perspectives on special education and kind of what are the important, what are the important factors that special educators, should be focusing on in their practice. So we have this statement, a very strong statement, and it comes early in the paper from which I took it. Student placement was the central issue in special education for far too long. and it remains a distraction for too many educators and policymakers.
Kaufman.
That was Kaufman, right. Kaufman was our advocate for not jumping headfirst into this idea or into inclusive education just because, you know, morally or philosophically, it just seems like the right thing to do. Any thoughts on this statement? Is student placement a distraction for educators and policymakers?
I don't know if I felt like it was a distraction, but what I think I felt, because I kind of went through this system with teaching,
Yeah.
was that we were really wanting to do this, but we didn't really prep for it correctly. So
Right.
we placed kids into the classroom without really putting in the strategies or helping the general ed teacher with the strategies they needed to make that successful.
Right, and that's essentially a crystallization of Kaufman's point, right? He's saying that, yeah, I can see a future in which, you know, fully inclusive education is going to be the ideal. But at this point, from his perspective, there still is work to be done before that realization comes into being. Recognizing the centrality of special instruction, keeping the place of instruction secondary, and preserving special education as a needed and visible part of public education are encouraging trends.
Kaufman.
Definitely Kaufman again. Now, what is he, does anyone have any thoughts on what he means by preserving special education as a needed and visible part of public education? What is he implying there?
I kind of assumed that he was talking about the difference between special education and general education. Like there's an exact reason as to why special education exists. And that's because we are serving a different purpose than general educators.
Right.
And so even if as special educators, we are pushing towards an ideal world of inclusion that still includes aspects of special education within the general education setting.
Mm-hmm.
And so he, I think, was pushing for us not to focus on so much about where they're getting this type of instruction, but so much more about what type of instruction we need to be providing for them.
Right. And he uses the word or the term visible part of public education. He's not keen on this idea of eliminating special education and moving towards a fully inclusive model where we don't really make these distinctions. He thinks it's very important that we do kind of maintain these two distinctions. But then we have a counterpoint here. And it's, you know, it's going to be pretty obvious which paper this came from. Over the past 20 years, considerable emphasis in special education has been placed on designing and implementing effective practices for enhancing outcomes for all learners, including those with disabilities served in general education classrooms. So she does, you know, there's some agreement here, right? Kaufman is suggesting that, you know, placement was a central issue in SPED for far too long. She's saying over the past 20 years, considerable emphasis in special education has been placed on, you know, kind of moving toward this inclusive model. But she emphasizes something that Kaufman really didn't, and that is the design and implementation of effective practices for enhancing outcomes for all learners. So I felt that that was an interesting distinction. So certainly they both recognize that there is this movement, you know, toward, you know, kind of eliminating the segregative aspect of special education. but she's kind of, emphasizing the fact that, well, yes, also in these 20 years, there's been emphasis on developing effective practices. And certainly Kaufman does discuss a few effective practices in his paper. And so she provides some evidence in support of her statement. She discusses the Regular Education Initiative, which was like the very first, movement toward inclusive education, the inclusive schools movement. And she emphasizes that this is a result of initiatives that entitled students with disabilities to be included in the general education setting aimed at promoting interaction between general and special education as a unified system. Now, do we think, does Kaufman think at the time of his writing that interaction between general and special education as a unified system was going to be possible?
Can you rephrase that? Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I'm just feeling like I read these like totally different than you did. I don't know. Like I didn't take them as like contradictory at all. But I think just because I was thinking of like Kaufman basically is saying like, hey, there's been too much of an emphasis on placement and we need more like scientifically based interventions no matter where the kid is placed.
Right.
Like, and then I was thinking that Vaughn and Swanson or whatever the other one was named, were more talking about like, hey, the emphasis that has been put on instruction, like they didn't really say how much it was. They actually talked about how much it has decreased. Mm-hmm. But what has been done has been very beneficial to special ed and gen ed. So like we should keep doing that. So I feel like they're kind of both arguing for the same thing. And I also don't feel like if there's a unified system,
yeah,
I don't necessarily think that one is more visible than the other in a unified system. Like you can have a unified system that still has two parts that are working like really well together, and that doesn't mean that one's not visible.
Right. It's not a melting pot, as it were.
Right.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is from one of the readings we read or if I recently read something else, so that's what I'm needing clarification on. Was it in Kaufman's article or anybody's article where they were talking about like scientifically based or evidence, scientific, I don't know, instruction, but that it only reaches your typical learner? Was that in either of these, or is this a different article I recently read?
I think that's a different article. I don't remember that.
They both talk about, scientific based, instructional practices,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't recall either of them explicitly, mentioning that this is only something that is, reaching general education students.
Darn, it was going to bring a really interesting perspective to the table, but if it's not from one of these articles.
Bring it.
I don't know. It had something to do with, so using these scientifically based practices to instruct our students, which benefits both parties, but they mentioned like the atypical learner and who it would be most benefiting, and we're still going to have outliers who are not reached by that.
Oh yeah, no, he did talk about that.
Okay, I'm like, oh my God.
Did absolutely talk about that.
I'm like, I don't read that much, so I honestly don't know where else I would have gotten this from.
Yeah, you're right. I remember that.
Okay, so I was, when I look at that previous statement from Vaughn where it says, we've had considerable emphasis, blah, 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 that one, where we have been implementing effective practices for enhancing outcomes, but we still have those learners that are not reached by those practices. That is potentially the reason for special education. So in that aspect, I do see them having differing perspectives, but Rachel, for the rest of it, I agree with you. I do kind of see them on the same boat.
Right, and so yeah, I mean, so maybe I am trying to contrive more of a contrast than there actually is, in their writing. But really, based on my reading of it, it really seemed that, Vaughn and Swanson were more kind of gung-ho about this inclusive education, whereas Kaufman was much more hesitant about it. Kaufman was much more, concerned with the fact that, you know, special educators weren't properly, or they weren't quite ready to make the move into the general education classroom because they had yet to, you know, kind of master some of the kind of effective instructional approaches that would be necessary to have mastered in order to better prepare general education teachers to deal with special education students.
I see your point there. He talks a lot about PBIS. Often,
Yeah, and that's his example of like an evidence-based instruction. And Swanson, or Vaughn and Swanson, talk about RTI.
Right. And I think that's where I kind of see a difference, in the sense that the RTI is more you're looking at the design of the instruction in the general education classroom and how it's being provided to support all learners. And I think that's where when you were talking about the atypical, that was under Vaughn, not Vaughn, that was under Kaufman, because he was saying typical instruction, we are left with the task of trying to devise atypical instruction that is effective for atypical learners. So I think he was looking at the fact that we hadn't prepared our general education classrooms yet for those kids and have the right instruction yet. Where I felt like Vaughn is saying the research that's being started is beginning to get that approach under control, and RTI was one of the main supporters of that for general education classroom. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So yeah, he does mention the fact that basically in a heterogeneous, you know, student body where we have people who are considered atypical learners, highly effective instruction is going to, you know, it's going to reach some learners much more effectively than it is going to reach other learners. And in that situation, well, that's going to lead to the need for special education, atypical instructional approaches for those students who were not able to, you know, benefit as much from this highly effective intervention. And
right.
A few of them.
But that's, oh.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know. I still don't really, I do think we read it differently, but I see why you read it the way that you did. But I guess like the Swanson Vaughn one, because they're talking about RTI, and the whole point of RTI is that it works for typical learners and it identifies atypical learners, right?
Right.
Like that's the whole point of it. And they were talking about that in that whole article about how just because a student hasn't gone through the entire RTI process yet does not mean you can't start other interventions. Like it's important to be able to recognize when there's a student that's like obviously an atypical learner.
Right.
So they weren't like arguing that every kid should be in gen ed. I just read that more as like hey, we need to fund special ed research because if we don't do that, like all the good interventions in gen ed is from us dummies. Like basically like that. I don't know. Like you're gonna screw gen ed and SPED if you don't like fund that research. I guess I took it as more of like a plea to fund special ed research.
But
the way that you get money in special ed is that you have to have it appeal to gen ed because gen ed is the majority.
Right. So yeah, you increase the likelihood of receiving funding if you have an intervention that's going to benefit both populations, basically.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I know we can probably work with the general so you don't like have a more of a tiny charge.
So, with the shift toward the expectation that all educators have responsibility for serving students with disabilities came greater need for instructional techniques effective for a wide range of learners that could be feasibly implemented in the general education setting. We are thus tempted to believe that if typical instruction is actually effective, it will be effective for all, especially if the word all is assumed not to include, or is assumed to include each and every living student. Whoa. That seems like a very kind of strongly worded statement there.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts on that?
I felt like when I read this, I just like recently in our own classroom have been dealing with like some kids who are borderline SPED students and borderline they're in RTI and we're just trying to identify them at this point. And so it's like, where do they fit in and how not everything is working for all students. So everything that's been tried in the classroom and all the RTI interventions that have been done are not working, but yet they're not qualifying for special ed. So they're not in this wide range of all students.
Right.
And so it's where do we put them and what do we do with them? And I mean, not everything is going to work for all students. And I feel like I've been having this conversation with some gen ed teachers lately about, okay, maybe these students are going to need to sit with you separately and do a different task, a different strategy, because what was happening right now for most of your class is not working for these particular two students. I guess I just refer to it like as, it's a very harsh statement, but it's kind of true. Like not all kids are going to learn the same and not all strategies are going to work for all students.
Right. And I think that's another one of Kaufman's main points is that it's just unrealistic to assume that that's ever going to happen, that we're going to find this one effective approach, to intervention, or this, effective evidence-based, instructional technique that's just going to work, equally well for all students with, no matter their kind of learning profiles.
Yeah, and like one of my jobs is to find different interventions right now, like different curriculums. And so that really fits in with like what I'm doing. Like I'm finding for one specific student what curriculum is going to help them. So
right, and so I already alluded to this quote here. I mean, so this is kind of what RTI does, right? As instruction improves for all students in a very large and heterogeneous group. So a group of students is, put into an RTI program that uses a, research-based intervention. Variations in learning are likely to get larger. Some students are going to, they're not going to need to go beyond tier 1. Some students are going to need to go into tier 2 and maybe go through a couple of different phases of tier 2. At that point, they are likely going to be referred for needing special instruction or special education.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was one of Kaufman's, one of the big pluses that he found, that he observed in his work in the field, being that special educators are showing greater concern for what is being taught and how it is being taught than where students are placed. And then here's a statement from, again, from Vaughn and Swanson, and they're talking about the introduction of RTI in the diagnosis of students with learning disabilities or learning impairments. It was included in the most recent reauthorization of the IDEA and has laid the groundwork for enhancing the performance of all students with and without disabilities through a common system where classroom teachers, special education teachers, and other specialists work together. So I do see some correspondence between, you know, these two statements, because they're both speaking to the importance of what is being taught and how it is being taught. And while, you know, Kaufman emphasizes the differentiation between that and where the student is placed, Vaughn and Swanson are specifically talking about kind of working in the context of general education classrooms. I found this was an interesting section of Kaufman's paper. Assuming that improving instruction in general education is the solution to special education's difficulty of identifying and serving students whose progress in general education has been unsatisfactory is a great temptation. So what's he saying here?
I think he's saying that there's like this rose-colored glasses version where like we can find the perfect curriculum that just like improves every single kid.
Right.
But that's never going to happen.
Right.
So although I do think that the good thing about RTI and other like gen ed intervention systems is that it helps identify the kids who truly are atypical learners, as opposed to like having kids just kind of get flooded in SPED because gen ed doesn't have any good interventions that
Right.
like would work for the general population. So I get his point that it's like, it's nice to think that there's like a unicorn, you know, curriculum that's going to like magically make all these kids like the perfect learners. But I get what he's saying, that like that doesn't ever happen, but I also do think we do still need to have like the best instruction possible so that we can actually truly identify atypical learners, as opposed to just like finding all the kids who aren't learning because maybe they're not getting the best instruction.
Right. Yeah. It's very realistic. It's important, yeah, that we are realistic, that this is never going to come into being, this perfect, you know, instructional curriculum or approach. But we have to assume that it's out there so that, you know, we have something to strive toward. We can't just say, well, you know, research has shown that learning differences are just too diverse, and so, you know, there's never going to be kind of a one size fits all, so we might as well just kind of, you know, just do what we think is best.
Right.
Certainly not the situation that we want to be falling into. And he talks about this, he gives a few reasons for why, you know, making this assumption might be heightened. He indicates that research on effective instruction obviously includes the instruction of at least somewhat heterogeneous groups of students in general ed. So instruction in the general case, or instruction of groups of general ed students, might be considered typical instruction. That the same effective instruction for one student or group can be assumed to be effective for all students. And I think we've pretty much come to the conclusion that this is certainly not the case. And lastly, that good instruction can be thought to narrow the differences in outcomes in all groups of students, such that all students achieve a common standard.
That always drove me so nuts as a gen ed teacher, because in my old district where I taught as a gen ed teacher, they would like always tell us there was this big push to make the goal for the growth goal for the lowest students higher than the growth goal for the highest students.
So that
we would always argue this, that like
meet
to close the gap. Yeah, they're like, we need to close the gap. And we would always argue like, well, if we're giving really good instruction, then the kids who are the quick learners are still going to learn quicker. Like, that's not realistic.
Right.
But there was like a huge push from admin on that, and it was like, it made no sense.
Right, and so that's kind of the point that he's making here.
That's weird. So you guys were made to make like achievement goals instead of growth goals?
No, it was supposed to be growth goals, but it was supposed to be that the lowest kids had to make the most growth. Yeah, this was not the district that I'm in now. It was on the west side of the state. But it was just, yeah, it was just not realistic. It really frustrated, especially like, you know, by the time kids got into like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, and it was like a kid who had made, you know, half a year's growth in reading every single year, but then they were expected to make like 2 years growth to try to catch them up or something. And it was like, how am I supposed to be the miracle worker who all of a sudden makes this kid like learn all of this when the pattern, like it shows that the realistic growth for this kid is this, and like that's okay. So like
Because
why,
we didn't
you know,
have the miracle curriculum yet.
no.
It's out there. It's out there somewhere.
And the frustration with that is then you have a kid that becomes, if you're working with that kid, you're talking about those goals and they know those goals are there for them to attain, you're making an unrealistic goal for them, and then they become more frustrated, and that just ends up causing them more problems in the long run than it helps.
Yeah. And it leads to a culture, I feel like, where the emphasis is on what kids are the lowest in. So the emphasis on for this kid is always like, you're behind in reading, you need to get better at reading, you need to get better at reading, you need to get better at reading, instead of focusing on, hey, you're at level in math. Like, let's focus on the fact that you're doing so great in math to like kind of build that confidence. But it's like such a focus on like weaknesses instead of on strengths.
It's a failure-based system.
Right.
You know?
Especially like high school level, when like the kids start to become aware of their own IEPs and like their own goals, and you know, are a big part of their own IEP team. And everybody at the meeting is like you said, Rachel, like, oh, well, you can't read still, but, and you're like, okay, but what can they do? Like, there's a reason that they're still being successful in school.
Yeah.
Right. Important to keep that in mind. Yeah, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and you know, oftentimes the weaknesses, you know, can be not fully overcome, but they can be, you know, developed to an extent great enough such that we can be successful. You know, you could still make a good living in this world if you're never going to be that good at math. It's still possible. So yeah, no, definitely the strengths, focusing on strengths is a very important mindset in this area. And so this is a comment, a quote from Swanson, or Vaughn and Swanson. And so now they're talking about the elements that are essential to the effective implementation of RTI. That students are provided with research-based instruction in the general education classroom. Kaufman didn't really seem to think that there were a lot of research-based instructions that would be effective in the general education classroom. He thought that the behavioral stuff had potential, but he didn't think that, you know, it seemed that his position was one such that most special educators weren't, you know, adequately equipped to go into the general education classroom and to provide it. Whereas I think that's somewhat of a different perspective than these authors are taking, because they believe that RTI is a research-based instructional method. Of course, they talk about at the end of the paper, you know, the fact that it does work for a lot of kids, but you know, there are studies that do show that it is, you know, not as effective as we want it to be. And so there still is room for growth. So, you know, then on that front, I guess they're you know, kind of in the same boat as Vaughn as well. That there still is need for increasing the efficacy of these research-based instructional strategies before they're brought into the general education classroom. Progress monitoring informs decision-making. Students need not move through each tier of instruction before being referred for a special education evaluation, but rather that students with SPED needs receive the services they require in the most timely manner. And Rachel, you already mentioned this. It's not necessary that a student goes through each tier. If it's very, very obvious early on that the kid is an atypical learner, well, that kid can just straight away be referred for a special education evaluation.
That's where I see a problem a little bit with RTI, because I think some people, I think it wasn't always implemented correctly. So it is, oh, you got to go through every intervention before you do anything. So I have one teacher who's a 4th grade teacher bringing me stuff, and she's like, why wasn't this addressed in 2nd grade? And, you know, it's like, because I didn't see it. You know, nobody brought forth this child and said, hey, we're flatline, we need to do something here. So we've gone from, you know, 2-3 years of instruction with a child that's been not making growth, and nobody has talked about it because they thought they had to, I assume they thought they had to do all these interventions first.
Before, yeah, right. Right.
And
It's like
I've referred to them early than late.
the belief that the structure needs to be followed kind of supersedes common sense, which is not appropriate.
My other problem I have and with RTI is that sometimes your kids that are attention deficit don't always fall into that category. So I had a teacher who had a student, and she was just looking at him as being a specific learning disability. And that we had already explored that. That was ruled out because we go by strengths and weaknesses. She failed to let us know that in the classroom, she had modifications going on, such as having him sit right next to her at the table. She was making sure there were certain things in place for him to be successful in the classroom. And all of those things pointed to a child that was having difficulty focusing. And had we started at that point instead of starting with SLD, we probably would have been able to get him on an IEP right away.
Right.
So it was kind of frustrating, and part of that was just teaching, or letting these teachers know that, because that's been actually in our school district, that has been a problem with administration, not recognizing that the ADHD kids need those accommodations. And could be either on a 504 or an IEP.
All right, so just a final slide here. So we have Kaufman up top again. Students differ in their ability to learn whatever is being taught. So helping all of them learn all they can as quickly as they can, which requires improving instruction equally for all of them, will add to the variance in the outcomes of effective instruction for all. And so that's kind of speaks to the comment that you made, Rachel, about, trying to basically close this gap, right? Because adding to the variance is just the opposite of closing the gap. It's making the gap even wider. And we contrast this with the statement from Vaughn and Swanson. A key feature of RTI is the existence of high-quality research-based classroom instruction that ensures every child, regardless of ability, has access to the best instruction possible, eliminating the assumption that difficulties are due to inadequate instruction. So there actually are some similarities between these two statements. Eliminating the assumption that difficulties are due to inadequate instruction. Well, in the case of this first quote by Kaufman, students who differ in their ability to learn, even if provided with this, highly effective instruction, this could still be considered inadequate instruction given the realities of their learning profiles. So that was kind of an interesting similarity between the two authors. So that's all that I really had for today. Are there any closing comments or any other questions, final thoughts, comments before we sign off for the evening?
So this is about RTI, which again, like my school is not an RTI school, even though like some people, there's like things that are RTI-ish about it, but there's not like a full RTI program. But I think that there's a misunderstanding that RTI is supposed to be like it's supposed to be specialized instruction, or that it's like a curriculum, when really it's just like a system of identifying students who really are atypical learners, and then remediating difficulties for students who aren't, and they just need a little bit extra intervention of like the typical learner intervention. So like I feel like this is a thing at my school a lot, because we don't have like a full RTI system. So we have kind of the opposite problem of what MARTA has, which is that we'll have students who didn't get like the intervention from like the Title I or reading or whatever from our like gen ed interventionists. And then they just go like straight to special ed, but then they end up in special ed for like a year and are given like basically similar interventions to what they would have gotten, and they end up catching up with their peers and like graduating out of their IEP in a year. So like what that tells me is like, okay, if we had given this kid the intervention through Title I or like the reading interventionist, they would have caught up on through that, and they would have never had to go through the whole special ed process. Because if a kid's able to catch up that quickly, they don't actually have a learning disability, you know? They just needed like more time with intervention.
Or the instruction that they were receiving wasn't adequate for helping them to achieve.
Right. So it's hard to tell. So I think that's what the second thing is saying, is that if there's not general education interventions provided, then you never really know if there was adequate instruction. Like if you never are documenting anything, because like, I hate to say this, it sounds really harsh, but can be like a very big difference in the quality of instruction given in the classroom, just depending on the teacher, depending on the resource, depending on whatever. So like there'll be kids who make very little growth because they just have a certain teacher who like that teacher just wasn't a good fit for them. Mm-hmm. And then they go into the next year with a teacher who is a better fit, and they make a ton of growth. So that was the instruction in the teacher. That wasn't the fact that the student couldn't learn it.
Right.
So I don't know. So I like the idea of RTI just because I feel like it at least like makes sure that you're not wasting all this time and effort and like emotional taxation giving kids IEPs and like having their parents go through that and having them go through all the testing and all of that, when it turns out that like, okay, they actually just needed to have a gen ed intervention.
Right. It eliminates like the subjectivity. And what I mean by that is this mismatch between the teacher and the student, right? Right. The gen ed intervention is a very objective kind of approach. It's going to kind of eliminate that kind of like any human factor that might be getting in the way of that learning.
Right.
So to Rachel's point, just a little bit, we had teachers that weren't we have RTI at our school, and they weren't like referring kids to RTI. Instead, they were referring kids to special ed. Like it got out of hand, and we're a very, very small school district. And we had teachers just referring kid. And so as a special ed team, we actually made the referral process a lot harder on teachers, and we made our forms a lot more difficult. And it actually has to say like, what strategies have you tried? Where have you gone with RTI? Have they been tested, and what are their scores? And you know, it just made it a lot more difficult for them to just automatically try and ship them off to special ed, because that really wasn't the placement for them. They just needed a reading intervention, or like you said, Rachel, maybe they just didn't mix with that teacher. And we've actually switched kids. We only have 2 teachers per grade level, and so we've switched them to a different teacher, and magically they have grown and caught up with their peers. And so I think it really does matter if you have RTI, and then the referral process, if it is a little bit more difficult, we found that teachers are really only referring kids now this year that actually really need to be referred. So we've kind of cut back on the referrals, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
overburden the teachers with work.
Yes.
Good strategy.
Took a team
Awesome.
of tired special ed teachers.
Well, thank you all again for a fruitful discussion. And I will be seeing you all next week. Have a good weekend. And, you know, if you have any questions as you get started on these bibliographies, as I already mentioned, reach out to me. Any other concerns? I'm an open ear. So thank you all. And we're signing off.